Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining another episode of the Educational Leadership Podcast. We have a very unique guest. We're changing things up a little bit here. So we actually have a retired superintendent and author and consultant focused on public education. So we're going to get some very unique perspectives today. And before we introduce our guest, I want to give a shout out to our co-host, Corinne French.
Hey, I'm so glad to be here today. This is going to be, we always say they're my favorite. We're having a favorite episode, a special guest, and this is going to be great. So I can't wait to get started. Thanks for being here today. And I'll let Gary go for the next one.
Yeah. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, right? So I'm just joking. I was trying to come up with a rhyme because Corinne said, so excited to be here today.
Hey.
Okay, but I won't go there. I don't have good rap songs. I'm not very good at that. Anyways, give a shout out to our sponsor. Our sponsor, Ideal Impact, is giving hundreds of millions of dollars in funding to public education, zero out of pocket, doesn't involve taxpayers. So if you are saying your school district needs funding, it's a perfect place to go to get funding really quick. And it's not a grant, it's recurring revenue every year. So anyways, talk to our sponsor if you need funding, Ideal Impact. And now let's get to our guest, Dr. Largent. Dr. Largent, thank you for joining us today.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you. And so obviously you're a friend of Corinne's. We're getting to know each other. Everybody listening in is getting to know each other, get to know you.
Right.
So if you can share a little bit about your background and kind of, your public education background, what brought you here today?
Yeah, quick background, I guess. I started out as a teacher coach, spent most of my career in East Texas, actually. Teacher coach, high school assistant principal, high school principal. And then I was a superintendent for 21 years and spent a total of 31 years in public education. I retired from Granbury ISD about 5 years ago, still live here in Granbury. And, I retired relatively young, I would say. And so I felt like I had a lot to give back to education that had, been my only career and only way of life, really, and since I got out of college. And so had some thoughts in my head about writing books, and also really enjoy working with school boards and working with educational leaders, and especially aspiring leaders. And so that's kind of the quick background, but I try to stay involved in education and stay up to date with what's going on and provide a service to those folks that need some help along the way. Sometimes people just need a ear to hear what they're going through and maybe a perspective from someone that's probably been through a lot of those things. So that's what I try to provide.
Love it. No, awesome. And Corinne, how did y'all tell us the story there? So you had met or read Dr. Largent's book?
Well, yes, I'm just a sucker for public ed books, of course. And I keep telling myself I'm not reading anything else until I finish my dissertation. But when his book first came out, well, I guess his second book came out, I downloaded it, and then he has some really great concepts that I like to use when I help boards or even in my own practice when I was a trustee. And so, yeah, I love his book. And I think one of the things I love about your book, we usually have superintendents and trustees on, and we've had a few authors. And I always say this about their books. I love when people just keep it simple and just tell us, right? Like, don't make me have to guess what you're saying. And I think that's such a disservice when authors do that, because then you're just like, is it poetry? And it's not rocket science to lead districts, but you do have some best practices in there. So I'll say one thing that I love. I love when you were saying, like, take a sheet of paper, fold it in half, and basically like write governance and like daily operations, and how simple that is. Not so simple for many trustees. I think I can with confidence say that my superintendent knew that I wasn't going to do that to him and get down in the weeds. But I don't know that I knew to do that without learning from people like you, because the tendency would be to get down in the weeds because you feel the responsibility of leadership. So I love that about your book. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about how did you decide what to put in the book?
Well, I write by writing outlines. And so I've kind of started this a few years ago, actually taking down notes and starting some basic outlines about what chapters and topics I may want to discuss in the book. And so really, when I retired, I had a pretty good start on an outline. It just took me a couple of years to put the thoughts together and obviously keep up with kind of what's going on currently. But I wanted to make it really like the book says, a blueprint for new and aspiring leaders. And it was written from a superintendent perspective, but there is a big section in there about school boards and team of 8 and how to run a meeting. And so I think there's some benefit there to anyone who is a school leader, who wants to be a school leader. And I think the trustees would gain a lot from the book just because they are hearing things from a superintendent's perspective. But, going back to your making things simple, I think in education, sometimes we make things too complicated. We have to have this piece of technology or the latest program that comes out or the latest guru that writes this 600-page book that, like you said, it's a lot of poetry and we have to read between the lines. What do they really mean? And so I just wanted to put something out there. Here's a handbook. Read it. It's simple. It's common sense. But unfortunately, a lot of superintendents, a lot of school boards don't do that. They make things more complicated and they get themselves into trouble because they don't follow common sense practices.
We didn't mention the title of the book. So will you tell us the title of the book? And then as you do that, talk about how you felt like tell us the title of the book and then the idea about leading in crisis. And I think
I have to say the book title was actually made before COVID. So it came out after COVID. So the title of the book is Leading in Chaos. And the subtitle is A Common Sense Blueprint for New and Aspiring School Leaders. So it kind of came out at the right time when we seem to be having a lot of chaos in our public schools around the country, really. And so the title should be catchy to a lot of people.
Yeah, for sure. So when we have a guest on that I know, I always feel bad for Gary because I have a million questions, but I'm going to ask one more and then I promise I'll stop for a little while. When we say chaos and crisis, I think a good leader who's been around for a while, this is not the first time a district has been in crisis or the world's been in crisis. We have others. If a district went through a drug crisis or a hurricane or a tornado, I mean, that's a crisis. So superintendents become experts in doing that. So talk about how did you have that confidence when you were a young leader and how did you get there? Just talk a little bit about that confidence and dealing with crisis and leading in chaos and maybe your journey.
Yeah, I found out, and I put this in the book actually, when I was a coach, I was the fiery, real aggressive, let's win, let's work hard, let's get after it kind of guy. And I learned when I got into administration that you can't be that aggressive with people. You can't yell at people. You can't have that attitude. And so I quickly learned when I became an assistant principal, really, that listening has to become a big part of your leadership style and really trying to be calm, especially in chaotic situations when you have school shootings or you have fires or you have vandalism or, the pandemic. It would be real easy to revert back to those days and just get mad and start screaming and running around like a chicken with her head cut off. But I think in those times, you really have to tone it down, know that people are watching you. You are the leader. People are looking to you for leadership. And so being able to calm it down is something that I think good leaders learn along the way. And I certainly had to learn that.
Love it. No, this makes perfect sense. So curious. So there's a lot going on in public ed right now, right? I mean, on a lot of different fronts.
Right.
Innovation, technology, politics, we won't get into some of those topics, right?
Sure.
But just curious, what are we looking into the future that, I mean, obviously you're involved with public education from a lot of different angles, involvements, experiences, that sort of thing. And what do you anticipate the changes coming up in education to be?
I think some of the changes are going to be due to legislation where we don't have any choice. You have to make some changes when it comes to school safety and curriculum, and maybe even topics like books in our libraries. Schools may not have a lot of choice in that because there may be legislation that dictates what we do, like we've seen some of that in the past. But I think I see a trend back to honestly more basic education. Let's make sure our kids have a real foundation of learning, especially in the elementary schools. And there's a lot of material out there, programs out there, and workshop based and project based, and those things can be good. But I think I'm hearing parents more and more say, we want our kids to really have a great foundation in the fundamentals of education, and that other stuff, we may want to experiment with some of that or use it partially during the year, but we want to make sure our kids are on the level they should be on. And I think that's not a bad thing.
I like that. And so there's been a lot of changes in public education over the years, right? With different innovations that come out, and you think about social media and the impact that had on public education. It seemed like, I could be wrong, it seemed like at first there was some hesitance, and then over time public education really started embracing it, right? So now you see all kinds of Twitter posts and things from
Right.
different entities. And when the pandemic hit, there was a leveling up on the technology side, right? So and I get it. Sometimes it's hard to make change, especially with big organizations, right? It's hard to make changes
Right.
fast. Now, and you, I'm not sure what your knowledge is on this topic, and this is not, these questions are not pre-scripted and planned and
Sure.
all this. But right now, there's been a big ripple in technology, artificial intelligence, right? So
Yeah.
Chat GPT, that's one thing. And I'm hearing some talk about that in some of the articles I've read on public ed recently. And basically, if you don't know what Chat GPT is, for those listening in, it's like Google, but Google on steroids, basically, where you go and you, instead of getting a list of articles you can read on a topic, it gives you a direct answer. You could give it 15 different variables happening in your life, ask it for its recommendation, and it will give you an answer, right? It'll give you a very
Yeah.
specific answer. So any idea, and I know we have no idea what's going to happen, but just any idea what kind of impact that could happen on public ed? Obviously at first there's going to be a lot of resistance, like, oh, wow, this is going to, kids are going to be writing their papers with this and all.
Right. Yeah.
But ultimately it's a tool, right? It's a tool that you can use. And so any ideas on what that may look like in the next few years?
Well, I think it goes back to we're training kids for a future where we don't even know what their jobs are going to be because it changes so much. So the whole Chat GPT issue is something that you can certainly see some benefits to, but you also see, it pretty much does away with homework. Why would you send home a kid with homework, write a 5-page paper, and their homework is go to Chat GPT and say, write me a 5-page paper on whatever the subject is, and it's done for you. So to me, that makes the in-class instruction much more important, so that you don't have to worry about those external technology things that are available now. But I think it's probably just a tipping point of where we're going with that. You may get into artificial intelligence instructors at some point where there may just be an aide in the classroom and you've got an artificial intelligence leading the class. I can honestly see that in the future. And we may not be too many years away from some of that. So yeah, it's why it's so critical that we have those kids with a base of learning and especially teach them to critically think. So how do you use something like this new technology? How would it be beneficial to society? And I'll go back to social media real quick, because you made the statement that schools kind of have embraced social media. And I would I would push back a little bit on that, because I think schools have responded with social media because they had to, because it became so easy for a disgruntled parent or teacher or administrator to just jump on social media and write something that may or may not be 100% true, and in fact may be 99% false. And so schools are having to respond to that. And so I think schools have gotten better at keeping parents informed about what's really going on in the schools, and using social media as a way to get in front of those issues that may be negatives out in the community. So but you're right, it's certainly become a tool that every school has to use in some way, and some do it better than others.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Corinne.
Well, I was just saying, I think it's what's hard for me now that I'm no longer a trustee and I'm watching superintendents and trustees, it's hard to be good at everything.
Yeah.
So if you were really great at leadership, you might not be really great at social media. And so I think it's this, or if a district is doing a really good job in maybe 90% of the areas, but then they're not great at communications, and they might. So I think it's hard because I think COVID, we all had to do everything online. So almost all of us were forced. And like to what you were saying, Jim, about like way before COVID, people were using social media, maybe putting negative information, but the balancing of all that, I think, is what's really hard. I want to take us to a place with something that we kind of mentioned already. And then there's a part at the end of the book that you use this. I think this is what I want to get on my friends that are in my doc program right now that are thinking of being a superintendent. So one, you talked about earlier, like when you're the leader, you've got to be able to handle when a school shooting happens. You can't be screaming, well, I knew this was going to happen someday, or this shouldn't have happened. Like you have to be it. You've got to keep it together. And I'm thinking about when one of my sons had a concussion and I was holding them and I was just like telling everybody what to do. And someone's like, I can't believe that you weren't freaking out. And I was like, oh, I was going to freak out. I just knew that in that moment, everything mattered. So it doesn't mean we're not affected. It doesn't mean it doesn't hurt us. It doesn't mean we're not mad, angry. Just at that moment, we've got to keep it together. Yeah. And so I think you did a good job of explaining that in real terms. But in the back of the book, you give a blueprint for people that want to be leaders. And I think that's important because it's hard to balance everything that you need to do to get to your next step. And I'm going to stop using the word balance, because balance would also mean that you care so much about being a superintendent and moving to that space that you might not take care of another area. And that's not what happens. So will you talk a little bit about how just to blend it all and stay emotionally healthy in the process? And we're not asking questions to trip you up any, but I think you have 31 years. That's a success story. And so what words of encouragement do you have for people who are maybe freaking out? School shootings are terrible. Sure. All this stuff that's happening politically, it's hard. So what kind of advice do you have to help them blend through and stay emotionally healthy as they move up the leadership ladder?
I think part of it is some people, it's a very unique job. There are only 1,000 superintendents in the state of Texas. It's a pretty unique situation. And the book was written for primarily superintendents, but also people that want to get into upper administration in schools. So they could use this as well. But I wanted to just lay out a blueprint. Here's what you do if you want to advance in this career. Here's how you look for jobs that you're a fit for. Don't apply for jobs that you're not suited for. If you're a third grade elementary PE teacher, you're probably not going to be a candidate for a 5A superintendent's job right now. So don't waste anybody's time by applying for that. But we talk about that. Then we talk about even as much as writing a letter of introduction when you send in your resume, make your resume stand out, how to sequence the resume, how to go through the interview process. And I got a lot of that, honestly, from sitting in on hundreds of interviews over my career and seeing how not to do it as much as I've seen how to do it. People come into interview for jobs, and you ask them about the campus where they want to be the principal, and they've never even been there. They haven't seen it. They didn't drive by it. They didn't do a simple search to see how many students were there. And so, just simple thing. Again, it goes back to simple common sense. But I tried to put together a chapter that if people would follow that blueprint, they would have a better opportunity to get in the door for an interview, which is the main goal. If you can't get an interview, you certainly can't get the job. So I tried to help them come up with ways to at least get in the room with the board or the committee or whoever's doing the hiring, and give them the best chance for success there.
It's great. I definitely recommend it. And I'm letting everyone know, all my colleagues in my courses. I know we never have enough time with our guests. So I'm sure Gary has the final question. And so
Right.
I want to just thank you for those 31 years of service. Thank you for a book that is helpful to my colleagues that are in my SMU coursework, and also my colleagues across the state that are still trustees. We care so deeply about the students in our state, and it's wonderful to have friends like you that are still doing great work. So
Thank you, Corinne. I
Thank you.
appreciate that.
Yes, so excited to have you on the podcast today, and thank you for sharing your perspective on public education with your experience and knowledge. So we got the last question here. This is going to be a tough one. I'm just giving you a heads up. This
You
one's going
just
to
cut
be.
out on me. I'm sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Hello.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
Yeah, it is kind of breaking up a little bit. Right before the main question, things went quiet.
I know. I think he might have froze. Or I think I can see you. I'm moving, so you can see if I'm moving. Can you see me?
Yes, I can hear you. I can hear you, Corinne. We'll just give it a minute or so, and we're having some technical difficulties. If we need to close out, we will. There we go.
Oh, well, you know what we can do?
Wait. I think he's rejoining us.
Are you there?
Yes.
Yay!
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Right in the middle of your question, both of you just froze up on me.
No, that works. That's the way it works, right?
Right.
The good questions. We had to create a little suspense there. So.
There you go.
No, we did not.
So yeah, we had to drop you out of the meeting, and now that we
There
have
we
him
go.
back, I should have a little commercial break in there or something. Okay, last question.
All right.
What leader in public education would you recommend come on here and share their story?
Oh, wow. Well, you've already had one of my favorites in Dr. John Kuhn over at Mineral Wells. He's a gem. There are so many great leaders around. Golly, if you could get Mike Moses on, I think he would be wonderful to talk to and provide some perspective from someone who's been a superintendent at a lot of different schools, and as well as worked in the university, and then was a commissioner of education at one time. So I know he doesn't do a lot of interviews, but if you could get him on, he would probably provide you some really good information.
Love it. Okay, we will definitely reach out to them, and I know we're running short on time, so just want to thank you, Corinne, for co-hosting, and Dr. Largent, thank you so much for being on today. And before we close out, we want to give a shout out to our sponsor one more time, Ideal Impacts, giving funding to districts. Every district needs funding. There's always a need for funding, right? And any district that says, hey, I can't use any more money, come on. There's a student or teacher or someone there that can use more funds. So reach out to our sponsor, Ideal Impact. It's a very easy process to get funding, no strings attached. And for those of y'all that have been tuning in, stay tuned for future episodes of the Educational Leadership Podcast.